Book Summary: The Black Swan. Author, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Prologue: On the Plumage of Birds. In the prologue, Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduces the concept of a black swan, a type of event that lies beyond everyday experience, has a massive impact, and is only explained post hoc in a contrived manner. Before Europeans discovered black swans in Australia, they were certain all swans were white. A single observation overturned millennia of certainty. From this, Taleb uses the black swan imagery to symbolize major surprises that disrupt the world we think we understand. Taleb points out that a black swan has three characteristics: it lies outside expectations because nothing in the past signals its occurrence, it produces enormous consequences, and after it happens, the human mind hastily constructs a rational story to make the event seem understandable, though in reality, it is not. He asserts that most turning points shaping the world, the rise of religions, breakthrough technological achievements, financial crises, major wars like World War I, the collapse of the Soviet Union, are black swans. Ironically, despite having the most profound impact, these events are rarely predicted in time. The error lies in humans' tendency to focus on what they know, what they have seen, what can be measured. This makes them blind to the unknown, the truly dangerous part. Taleb not only critiques linear thinking and the misuse of predictive models in social sciences but also warns that in a world dominated by unpredictable shocks, certainty is an illusion. Therefore, instead of trying to predict the unpredictable, he recommends learning to adapt to uncertainty, living with it, exploiting it, and not letting it defeat us just because we overly trust smooth curves. Chapter 1: The Apprenticeship of an Empirical Skeptic. Taleb begins the book with personal recollections of his childhood in Lebanon, where he grew up in what seemed an ideal society, a multi-religious community, Christian, Muslim, Druze, living harmoniously for centuries. He calls this place a Mediterranean paradise, where French, Greek, and Arab cultures blended in a delicate balance. Beirut, the city he cherished, resembled California with its beaches, mountains, and open lifestyle. Yet, this paradise collapsed unexpectedly in 1975 when civil war erupted. A society believed to be stable turned to rubble. According to Taleb, this event was a black swan. No one predicted it, but it completely altered the structure of reality and the way the world was perceived. The irony is that everyone, from scholars to ordinary citizens, had rational reasons to think it would not happen. From this, Taleb introduces the triplet of opacity. 1. We overestimate what we know. 2. We overlook or fail to recognize what we don't know. And 3. We don't understand that history progresses through random leaps rather than linear developments. He emphasizes that the past is often explained through smooth but fabricated stories, what he calls the narrative fallacy, making us think we understand when we are actually blinded by an imagination misaligned with reality. Taleb further recounts his youth, participating in protests against the absurdities of the government, and realizing that the system everyone trusted could crumble in days. He particularly warns about the complacency of predictive models, products of intellect he deems dangerous because they try to turn a chaotic world into easily readable charts. The Lebanese Civil War not only destroyed his homeland but became his first vivid lesson: to understand the world, one cannot trust appearances or smooth logic but must confront uncertainty and learn to live with it like an empiricist, always skeptical, always observing, and always prepared for the unpredictable. Chapter 2: Yevgenia's Black Swan. Taleb introduces the fictional character Yevgenia Nikolaevna Krasnova, a peculiar writer, a neuroscientist PhD with a complicated personal life, who wrote a profound philosophical novel titled A Story of Recursion. The book was initially rejected by publishers because they couldn't categorize it as fiction or non-fiction. It was too hard to classify, and it lacked a clear market. Thus, her work was forgotten for years. She lived quietly, far from the spotlight, and made no effort to please mainstream tastes. Then, unexpectedly, a prominent critic mentioned the book on a TV show, and overnight, Yevgenia became a global phenomenon. Her book was translated into dozens of languages and sold millions of copies. The success came not from marketing strategies or targeting the right audience but from a random, unpredictable spark, a true black swan, unexpected, with widespread impact, and later rationalized by analysts as if they had foreseen it. Taleb emphasizes, in fields belonging to extremism, where outcomes are distributed non-linearly and heavily influenced by rare events, such as publishing, music, art, or science, success is often the result of luck, not necessarily talent or calculation. Yevgenia exemplifies the inherent unfairness of the creative world. Countless people more talented than her are forgotten because they didn't encounter the right tipping point. Taleb uses her case to critique the common illusion that effort inevitably leads to success. On the contrary, he encourages accepting uncertainty, living with randomness instead of trying to control what is beyond reach. In a world driven by black swans, the wisest approach is not to predict but to learn to embrace the unexpected, as Yevgenia did. Chapter 3: The Speculator and the Prostitute. Taleb distinguishes two types of professions: scalable ones, like writers, artists, or speculators, where a single product can generate immense value with near zero incremental cost, and non-scalable ones, like bakers or doctors, where income is tied to the limited effort and time of the individual. He provides an example. J.K. Rowling doesn't need to rewrite every time someone reads Harry Potter, while a baker must knead dough for each new customer. A speculator can make $1 million with a phone call from a bathtub, but a doctor cannot diagnose remotely by deep thinking. The modern world, with technology and globalization, increasingly favors scalable professions, thereby amplifying inequality and creating fertile ground for black swan events. One person may only slightly outperform others, but due to the ripple and imitation effects in society, they take the entire reward, a phenomenon called winner-take-all. Taleb introduces two probability domains, mediocristan, where variables are evenly distributed with no significant deviations, e.g., height, weight, and extremistan, where a single individual can dominate the outcome, e.g., Bill Gates' wealth or Rowling's book sales. In extremistan, a single observation can skew the entire picture, and this is where black swans reign. He points out that in such environments, effort and talent are no longer the sole determinants of success. Luck, especially initial luck, often creates cumulative advantages over time, as in the Matthew effect, the one who has will be given more. Thus, the belief that success always reflects effort is a dangerous illusion. Finally, Taleb warns that the bias toward extremistan makes society more vulnerable. Economic, technological, or media shocks can spread and cause cascading collapses. Meanwhile, those in non-scalable professions, the true builders of society, are left behind. He does not advocate choosing scalable professions but emphasizes that one should only do so if prepared to live in a random, harsh, and volatile world, where failure is possible despite doing everything right. Chapter 4: 1001 Days, or How Not to Be a Sucker. Taleb opens the chapter with the famous turkey metaphor. Fed every day for 1,000 days by a kind owner, the turkey grows increasingly confident it lives in a safe world, until day 1001 arrives, Thanksgiving, and it is slaughtered. The lesson: the more past data suggests everything is fine, the more dangerous it is if you're unaware of black swans. This illustrates the problem of induction, the mistake of inferring the future from the past without accounting for surprises. Taleb cites two philosophers, Sextus Empiricus, who proposed skepticism as an intellectual therapy to maintain mental stability amid chaos, and Al-Ghazali, who called dogmatic scholars gabi, fools, and wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa to critique blind faith in reason and formal science. Both emphasize the limits of knowledge based on experience. Taleb points out that in fields like economics, finance, or politics, realms of extremistan, prediction is a dangerous farce. Financial investors, for example, failed to foresee major crises like 2008 because their models relied on smooth, linear assumptions. He calls this the assumption that history is readable, leading to deadly complacency. Taleb particularly criticizes simplistic statistical models based on Gaussian distributions, deeming them the great intellectual fraud because they assume the world operates on a smooth curve, while reality is full of ruptures, anomalies, and surprises. Tools like standard deviation, variance, or modern portfolio theory only create an illusion of control, not understanding. He calls for disciplined skepticism, not negative denial, but alertness to what we think we know. In a world where a single observation can topple an entire system, recognizing the limits of knowledge is not just humility, it's survival wisdom. As Taleb warns, becoming a sucker is the natural outcome of blindly trusting what has happened, forgetting that the unexpected is always lurking in the shadows. Chapter 5, Confirmation Schmontermation. Taleb begins the chapter with a warning about a common thinking error, confirmation bias, the tendency to seek only information that supports existing beliefs and ignore contradictory evidence. He illustrates, if someone believes all swans are white, they won't notice a black swan, until they see one with their own eyes. This distorts understanding and leads to the illusion of knowing something. Taleb asserts that, in the pursuit of truth, a single counterexample is worth more than 1,000 confirmations. He cites philosopher Karl Popper, who advocated the theory of falsification, that what makes science is its ability to be disproven, not confirmed. A single black swan can overturn the entire all swans are white theory, but a million white swans cannot prove it true. In everyday life, this confirmation error is pervasive. Investors focus only on profits while ignoring risks, social scientists select data fitting their theories and overlook critical outliers. From this, Taleb sharply criticizes naive empiricism, when we gather facts to prove what we already believe instead of testing whether we might be wrong. He provides examples from medicine and psychology. People often confuse no evidence of disease with evidence of no disease, an error called the round-trip fallacy. Similarly, seeing O.J. Simpson not killing anyone at breakfast cannot be evidence of his innocence. Taleb also recounts the famous experiment by psychologist Peter Wason, where participants were asked to guess the rule behind the sequence 246. Most only generated sequences confirming their hypothesis, instead of trying to disprove it with contrary sequences. This shows the human instinct is to reinforce what we think, not to seek proof we're wrong. In conclusion, Taleb emphasizes, disciplined skepticism is the most effective weapon in a world rife with black swans. Testing beliefs and accepting the possibility of being wrong is not just intellectual humility, it's a wise way to live in an uncertain reality. Chapter 6, The Narrative Fallacy. Taleb explains the narrative fallacy, the human tendency to create stories to explain the world, even though much of it is random and chaotic. He recounts a conversation with an Italian reader who agreed with his argument against over-explanation but then proceeded to explain his own views by citing his upbringing in a Mediterranean Orthodox society, a classic example of the narrative fallacy. Taleb analyzes, the human brain, especially the left hemisphere, is programmed to fill in the gaps by finding patterns and constructing causes. Through studies of split-brain patients, he shows that when one hemisphere acts without reason, the other still tries to concoct a rational explanation, despite lacking any basis. He warns that history, media, and social sciences often present event sequences as if they have tight causal links, while many outcomes are simply due to luck. A successful company is praised for its smart strategy, though hundreds of others with similar strategies fail. We are drawn to memorable, emotionally resonant stories, but they lead to the illusion of understanding what's happening. Taleb also criticizes how the media portrays billionaires with post hoc myths, ignoring the graveyard of millions who failed with similar strategies. He emphasizes that in extremism, where extreme events dominate outcomes, resisting the narrative fallacy is crucial for making sound decisions. In conclusion, Taleb calls for accepting that many events simply cannot be clearly explained and learning to live with uncertainty. He writes, curb the word because, only use it when we have experimental evidence, not from historical recollection. Chapter 7, Living in the Antechamber of Hope. Taleb describes the state of waiting for a breakthrough in fields like art, business, or investing, realms of extremism where rewards are unevenly distributed and major opportunities often come unexpectedly. He introduces Nero Tulip, a fictional trader who employs a bleed strategy, accepting frequent small losses to await a rare event that yields massive profits. Nero accepts being seen as a temporary failure, believing one great year can offset a decade of losses. Taleb calls this state the antechamber of hope, where many writers, artists, entrepreneurs spend their lives waiting for one big break, but most never see it come. The anticipation brings excitement but is also a mental trap that prevents practical action. For example, a writer might spend years waiting to be published instead of improving their writing daily. He also references the character Drogo from the novel El Desierto de los Tartaros, who spent 35 years waiting for war to break out, only to die in disappointment. Taleb warns that placing all expectations on a single scenario makes us vulnerable to uncertainty. Instead of waiting blindly, he proposes building resilience, surviving over time, avoiding collapse due to misplaced expectations, and being ready for surprises. In a world full of black swans, flexibility, not accurate prediction, is the key to survival. He concludes, the wisest thing is not to believe the opportunity will come but to live so that if it does, you're alert enough to recognize and seize it. Chapter 8, Giacomo Casanova's Unfailing Luck, The Problem of Silent Evidence. Taleb introduces the concept of silent evidence, the information not recorded because it simply doesn't exist before our eyes. He uses the image of Giacomo Casanova, the adventurer, fugitive, legendary lover, as a symbol of luck. Despite countless perilous situations, Casanova always miraculously escaped. But Taleb warns, the Casanovas who failed didn't survive to write memoirs. We only see the winners, leading to an illusion about skill and destiny. From investing to war, from medicine to media, Taleb points out that society repeatedly makes this error. We praise successful investors while forgetting the thousands who lost and vanished into the graveyard of failures, where no one writes books or gets interviewed. Traits like courage, decisiveness, or risk-taking are hailed as the recipe for success, but they're equally abundant among those who failed, yet no one mentions them. Taleb likens it to this: if you only calculate the odds of hitting the jackpot from the winner's perspective, you'll think they have extraordinary ability. But looking at the entire initial group, it's just pure luck. He calls this the illusion of stability. Once you survive, you forget how high the risks once were. His clear message: don't judge the world only by what stands out and is recounted. Always ask, who disappeared from the story? Who isn't mentioned? That silence reveals the full scope of risk and reality. Chapter 9, The Fallacy of the Game World. Taleb calls it the Ludic fallacy, the error of applying probability models from games with clear rules, like dice or casinos, to the real world, which is full of uncertainty and black swans. He contrasts two characters, Dr. John, a logical mathematician who believes in ideal probability distributions, and Fat Tony, a real-world person who understands that if 99 coin flips yield tails, the 100th is unlikely to be fair, that coin is rigged. Taleb criticizes the use of Gaussian, bell curve, distributions, suitable for mediocristan, to model financial markets, which belong to extremistan. He points out that economists, risk managers, and financial experts are brainwashed by scientific theories that don't apply in reality, leaving them unable to predict or prevent crises like 2008. He emphasizes that in reality, the rules of the game constantly change, and outcomes don't follow fixed distributions. While chess has clear rules, life does not. Taleb argues that the complexity of markets, society, and history demands a skeptical and flexible approach, not blind trust in mathematical formulas. His final message: if we treat the world like a casino with fixed rules, we'll be blindsided and fall when a black swan appears. Only by learning from empiricism, acknowledging model limitations, and being ready to adapt can we survive and succeed in this unpredictable world. Chapter 10, The Scandal of Prediction. Taleb sharply criticizes the prediction industry, from economics, politics, to finance, calling it an intellectual scandal. He argues that experts consistently fail to forecast major events like financial crises, political revolutions, or market crashes. The reason is their overestimation of their knowledge, a phenomenon he calls epistemic arrogance. Taleb cites Philip Tetlock's study, which examined 27,000 predictions by about 300 experts across fields. The results showed experts predicted no better than lay people, and the most famous ones had higher error rates. More alarmingly, they often refused to admit mistakes, using excuses like the game changed rules or it was a black swan, unpredictable. Taleb argues the issue isn't a lack of information but the illusion of knowing more than we do. Overconfidence leads to dangerous decisions, especially in complex systems like finance. For example, risk managers relied on models assuming market stability but were blindsided when crises hit. Instead of trying to predict the future, Taleb recommends building resilient systems, diversifying, limiting risks, preparing for surprises. In extremistan, one prediction error can destroy an entire system. The wisest approach is not to predict accurately but to accept uncertainty and prepare thoroughly to avoid being wiped out. Chapter 11, How to Look for Bird Poop. Taleb opens with a simple question: why do we keep trying to predict the future when major breakthroughs come by chance? He recounts unplanned discoveries. Alexander Fleming found penicillin due to a contaminated petri dish. Charles Townes invented the laser out of curiosity to split light beams, not thinking of retinal surgery or CD reading. Taleb argues that instead of controlling the future, we should create an envelope of serendipity, increasing exposure to possibilities to boost the odds of encountering positive black swans. Like empirical scientists, startup entrepreneurs, or venture capitalists, major success often comes from trying many times rather than a perfect plan. He cites a biotech company he visited, which didn't predict the right research path but let scientists experiment freely, and they discovered Viagra while studying hypertension drugs. This holds true for America's innovation culture, where failure is encouraged, and each mistake is a step closer to a breakthrough. Taleb's message is, in extremistan, what matters often can't be planned. Look for bird poop, meaning stay open to small, unexpected, strange things. Because, as with the painter Apelles' canvas, a random splash might create perfection. Chapter 12, Epistemocracy, a Dream. Taleb envisions an ideal society he calls epistemocracy, where those in power aren't the ones claiming to know things but those who understand the limits of knowledge. In such a society, intellectual humility is valued, and decision-makers are always aware of uncertainty instead of clinging to easy models or theories. He cites philosopher Michel de Montaigne as the epitome of an epistemocrat, someone who spent much of his life contemplating the limits of human thought, living with skepticism, and writing essays to test ideas, not assert truths. Montaigne's study was filled with Greek and Latin quotes about the fragility of knowledge. Taleb criticizes the current world, where experts and policymakers act overly confident in predicting the future, from oil prices to growth rates, inflation to wars. Yet, history is rife with failures due to the illusion of knowledge, like the global financial crisis that risk models couldn't foresee. Instead of aiming for accurate predictions, an epistemocracy would prioritize designing resilient and flexible systems, investing in preventive healthcare, building safer banks, or encouraging small-scale experiments in technological innovation. In extremistan, where unexpected events dominate, humility and practical preparation are the ultimate shields. Taleb concludes, the dream of epistemocracy is not a fantasy but a rational response to a chaotic world, where truth is never absolute, but survival always demands honesty about what we don't know. Chapter 13, Apelles the Painter, or What Do You Do If You Cannot Predict? Taleb opens with the story of Apelles, an ancient Greek painter. In despair over failing to paint a horse's foam, he threw a sponge at the canvas, and was astonished to find it created the perfect effect. Taleb uses this to illustrate a greater truth: in an unpredictable world, randomness and mistakes sometimes produce masterpieces. Thus, instead of predicting, he proposes practical action strategies: prepare to survive surprises and seize opportunities. The chapter's core is the barbell strategy: allocate 85 to 90% of assets to ultra-safe investments, like government bonds, and the remaining 10 to 15% to high-risk but potentially breakthrough investments, e.g., startup stocks, options. Taleb emphasizes that instead of pursuing average risk, a dangerous illusion, embrace asymmetry: no risk on one end and unlimited potential on the other. This protects against negative black swans while accessing positive ones. He calls for a mindset of loving small failures, avoiding major disasters, advocating for continuous experimentation, flexibility, and exposure to surprises, from chance encounters, odd ideas, to volatile environments like big cities. In extremistan's world, Taleb concludes that adaptability, embracing randomness, and designing life to withstand uncertainty are the keys to surviving and succeeding. Chapter 14, From Mediocristan to Extremistan, and Back. Taleb distinguishes two probability worlds: mediocristan, where events are evenly distributed with no major deviations, e.g., human height, weight, or calorie consumption, and extremistan, where a single individual or event can dominate outcomes, like Bill Gates' wealth or J.K. Rowling's book sales. In mediocristan, no single event significantly affects the whole. In extremistan, one small shock can skew the entire chart. Taleb argues that the modern world is shifting from mediocristan to extremistan due to the growing role of technology, the internet, and globalization. Phenomena like network effects and cumulative advantage allow the successful to gain more, leaving most others behind. Nonlinear propagation, such as a viral video or a global financial crash, is a typical outcome. In this environment, Taleb warns that traditional prediction models become useless, as they don't account for extreme events. Thus, instead of controlling the future, he proposes, build flexible, resilient systems, like diversifying investments, spreading risks, and reducing dependence on oversized entities. For example, an economy of many small businesses is more stable than one dominated by a few giant corporations. Taleb concludes that understanding the difference between mediocristan and extremistan is a prerequisite for managing risk correctly in today's uncertain modern world. Chapter 15, The Bell Curve, That Great Intellectual Fraud. Taleb directly attacks the use of the bell curve, Gaussian distribution, in economics, finance, and social sciences, where extreme events occur far more often than the model predicts. He calls it the great intellectual fraud. According to Taleb, the Gaussian is only suitable for mediocristan, where things are evenly distributed and changes are small, like human height. But the modern world is extremistan, where one event can change everything, like a financial crisis or pandemic. He contrasts it with the Mandelbrottian distribution, which has fat tails, meaning rare but massively impactful events dominate outcomes. Taleb recounts the history of the bell curve, starting with Gauss, used to measure astronomical errors. It was misused by Adolphe Quetelet, whom he calls the average monster, to define the average person and impose the model on society, thus denying all anomalies like black swans. He criticizes Nobel laureates Merton and Scholes for using the Gaussian in risk management at LTCM, a model that excluded major shocks, resulting in the fund nearly collapsing the global financial system in 1998. Taleb argues that the academic community is enchanted by the smoothness of mathematics over reality. He calls for abandoning models assuming small volatility and embracing large-scale randomness with power law, fractal, and nonlinear distributions, those reflecting the real world. Chapter 16, The Aesthetics of Randomness. Taleb concludes the book by praising randomness, not only as a reality to accept but also as an aesthetic inspiration. He argues that in the modern world, where extreme events increasingly dominate, we must learn to see the beauty and creative power of the unpredictable. He cites the work of Benoit Mandelbrot, the pioneer of fractal geometry, as evidence that randomness has its own order and can produce stunning imagery. Fractals exhibit self-similarity, where small structures mimic the whole, from coastlines and tree branches to lungs and financial markets. Fractals not only transformed mathematics but also inspired architecture, music, painting, and poetry. Taleb asserts that many breakthroughs in art, science, or technology, like the laser, Viagra, or the iPhone, stemmed from mistakes, coincidences, or chance discoveries, not detailed plans. He likens living in a random world to seizing opportunities from bird poop, where the seemingly trivial unexpected can lead to major breakthroughs. Taleb argues that randomness refreshes society, breaks down the outdated, and opens paths for newcomers. In art, like Caravaggio's paintings or Bach's music, imperfection and variation create depth and vitality. He concludes, living with randomness is not just a survival strategy against black swans but also a beautiful way of life, an aesthetic choice in an uncontrollable world. Chapter 17, Locke's Madman. Taleb opens the chapter with the concept of Locke's madman, someone who reasons impeccably from false premises. He applies this to criticize economists like Robert Merton, whom he sees as epitomizing the mathematization of false knowledge, Platonified knowledge. According to Taleb, Merton and followers of neoclassical economics built models on entirely unrealistic assumptions, e.g., Gaussian probabilities, rational behavior, equilibrium states, then produced elegant but useless theorems. Their models are like Monopoly, perfectly logical internally but completely detached from reality. Taleb recounts the collapse of the LTCM hedge fund, founded by Merton and Scholes, as evidence of the disaster caused by applying theoretical models in extremistan. The fund went bankrupt in 1998 because its model ruled out major shocks, a classic madman case, tight logic, wrong premises. He calls for abandoning theorem-driven thinking and adopting skeptical empiricism, observing reality, testing assumptions, and accepting the imperfection of knowledge. Taleb likens empiricists to medieval surgeons, hands bloodied, far more effective than theoretical physicians. Taleb concludes, in a world full of black swans, flexible thinking, real-world validation, and skepticism of knowledge are the only paths to survival and avoiding becoming a rational madman from false assumptions. Chapter 18, The Uncertainty of the Phony. Taleb harshly criticizes the phonies in finance and economics, those who pretend to understand but rely on outdated models that don't reflect reality. He argues the issue is not just wrong models but also overconfidence, a form of epistemic arrogance, that blinds them to their own limits. Taleb cites how banks, financial institutions, and policymakers use Gaussian distributions to measure risk, while real events often fall outside the model. The 2008 financial crisis was an inevitable outcome of using ill-suited tools in an extremistan world. He proposes the opposite mindset: acknowledge ignorance, focus on designing systems that withstand chaos rather than trying to predict. A prime example is the barbell strategy: allocate most assets to ultra-safe instruments and the rest to high-risk investments that could yield breakthrough returns, thanks to positive black swans. Taleb also guides how to spot phonies. They speak fluently, present polished models, wear ties, but take no responsibility for real-world consequences. In contrast, those who truly understand accept randomness, remain skeptical, and are ready to adjust when new evidence emerges. He concludes, in a world driven by black swans, no one knows for sure what's coming. But if you know you don't know, you have a chance to survive, even thrive. Chapter 19, Half and Half, or How to Get Even with the Black Swan. Taleb concludes the book with a life manifesto: learn to live with uncertainty, not control it. He shares that he is half and half skeptic, half certain, half conservative, half adventurous, half hating, half loving black swans. The chapter's core is the barbell strategy, a method that both protects against negative risks and opens opportunities for positive risks. Taleb proposes allocating about 85 to 90% of assets to ultra-safe investments, like government bonds, and the remaining 10 to 15% to high-risk ventures like startups or options. This way, if a negative black swan hits, you survive; if a positive one arrives, you soar. He emphasizes that flexibility in action and humility in cognition are the only ways to survive in extremistan. Missing a train might save you from an accident, and sometimes, missing something opens better paths. Taleb calls this the grace of omission, refusing to chase goals others set. He calls for living simply but wisely, care about risks not to fear them but to proactively design a life that doesn't collapse when surprises hit. A business diversifying products, an individual flexible in career shifts, or an investor managing tail risks are all embodying this philosophy. Taleb concludes, getting even with black swans isn't about predicting them but building a life so that when they appear, you still stand, even leverage them to soar.